The truth about Bitcoin's greatest threat is here. Watch the 51% Attack podcast before it's too late.
Imagine this for a second. A frantic news alert, it just flashes across every screen you see. Not just, a market dip, but a headline screaming, Bitcoin network under siege, transactions freezing up, prices tanking, and the whispers, they quickly turn into shouts about a 51% attack. Suddenly, there's this terrifying shadow of doubt cast over the very foundation of digital money. For millions of people, that trust they place in this whole decentralized idea, it's suddenly, maybe brutally questioned. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging right into that very scenario, the 51% attack. We're going to rigorously analyze its relevance and critically assess the enduring security of Bitcoin right here in 2025. Our mission, to extract the most important insights from our sources on this, foundational challenge to decentralization. We want to cut through the noise, get to the core of what you really need to understand about this theoretical, yet potentially potent threat.
And this deep dive is absolutely essential, because we're going to peel back the layers of this complex theoretical attack. We'll look at real-world historical incidents, the ones that have plagued other cryptocurrencies. And then, importantly, we'll put Bitcoin's current defenses and its future outlook right under the microscope. Understanding why this matters, it goes far beyond just the tech side of things. It's really about the very fabric of the broader digital economy. And fundamentally, how much trust we can truly place in these decentralized systems that are, let's face it, reshaping our financial landscape.
Right. So let's start at the beginning then, the bedrock. At the core of Bitcoin's security, its sort of primary bodyguard, is something called proof of work, POW. It's basically been the cornerstone of decentralized crypto security since Bitcoin first launched, way back in 2009.
That's exactly right. And the fundamental purpose of proof of work, its main job, is to secure the network against what we call double spend attacks. It effectively makes it prohibitively expensive and just computationally really, really hard for any malicious actor to go back and rewrite the blockchain's transaction history. You can kind of think of it like a global competition. There's this huge decentralized network of participants, we call them miners, and they use incredibly powerful specialized computer hardware, often custom-built chips called ASICs, and they're all racing against each other constantly, trying to solve a complex cryptographic puzzle, the first one to find the solution. They get to validate a batch of transactions, bundle them into a new block, and add that block to the chain. It's this continuous, incredibly energy-intensive process.
And that collective effort, all that computing power grinding away globally, that's what we call the network's hash rate.
Right.
It's the total processing power dedicated to securing the network at any given moment, sometimes called the security budget.
Exactly.
And the relationship is direct, isn't it? Higher hash rate means more security.
Precisely.
What's really fascinating here, I think, is how this massive distributed power makes rewriting history just, virtually impossible for anyone playing by the rules.
Indeed. And this concept is tightly linked with Bitcoin's longest chain rule. This is a really key principle. It basically dictates that if the network ever sees two competing versions of the blockchain, maybe due to a temporary split or something, it will always accept the chain that has the most cumulative proof of work baked into it. That's the canonical, the valid version.
Meaning the chain that took the most computational effort, the most energy to build?
Exactly. It's an elegant sort of mathematical consensus. It's designed to distribute power, prevent any single entity from just taking over, and really foster that decentralized system Bitcoin was envisioned as. It relies on math, on computational proof, not on trusting any single person or company.
Okay, so if proof of work is the bodyguard, what happens when that bodyguard is, at least theoretically, compromised? That brings us squarely to the 51% attack. Sometimes you hear it called a majority attack. This is a critical, maybe even existential threat to any proof of work blockchain. It happens when one single entity, or maybe a group working together, manages to get control of over 50% of the network's total mining hash rate. That huge pool of computing power we talked about.
And that over 50% threshold, it's absolutely crucial. It's the magic number, so to speak. Once an attacker crosses that line, they can effectively influence the network's consensus. They can sway how transactions get validated. This goes directly against the core principles, decentralization, transparency, immutability that blockchains are supposedly built on. The potential consequences, they're severe. An attacker could perform double spends. That's the classic one, spending the same money twice. They could block legitimate transactions from ever getting confirmed, basically paralyzing the network. And maybe the most insidious part, they could just completely erode the fundamental trust users have in the entire system.
That trust is everything, isn't it?
It really is. But it's really vital to clarify a common misunderstanding here. A 51% attack does not allow an attacker to just steal funds directly from other users' wallets. They can't just grab your Bitcoin.
Okay, that's important.
Yeah, and they can't create new, unauthorized coins out of thin air either. Its power lies solely in manipulating and rewriting their own past transactions on the ledger, usually for their own financial benefit, not arbitrary theft or minting.
Got it. So how does this actually play out on a technical level? It sounds like some kind of sophisticated digital race, maybe a hidden chess match happening behind the scenes.
It truly is like that. The technical process, how a 51% attack works on a POW chain, it usually starts with the attacker secretly mining their own private chain of blocks. This private chain is completely isolated. It's hidden from the main public network. Think of it like a secret parallel history. While all the honest miners are busy building on the public, canonical chain, the attacker, because they have that majority hash rate, they mine new blocks on their private chain faster than everyone else can on the public one.
Ah, because they have more power.
Exactly, more horsepower. And this private chain, it's intentionally withheld. It stays invisible to all the other nodes on the network for a time.
So it's like this hidden race that the attacker's pretty much guaranteed to win eventually because they control more than half the effort. And this leads to that critical moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the attacker's private chain, the one they've been building in the shadows, finally becomes longer, or more accurately, has more cumulative chain work than the public chain.
Yes, cumulative work is the key metric.
It's like their secret faster train finally catches up to and then overtakes the public one, carrying its own version of history.
Precisely. At that exact moment, a moment the attacker chooses strategically, they suddenly broadcast their now longer malicious private chain out to the entire public network. And remember that longest chain rule we talked about.
Yeah, the network always follows the chain with the most work.
Exactly. It kicks in right here. The network's nodes, all these computers participating, they receive this new, apparently valid, longer chain with more accumulated proof of work. And they automatically switch over. It's programmed behavior. They just abandon the previous canonical chain and all the blocks and transactions that were on it in that replaced section.
Wow. So the old history just gets orphaned.
Orphaned, exactly. This event is what we call a chain reorganization, or just a reorg for short. The malicious chain, the attacker's chain, becomes the new accepted version of history. And this effectively erases the transactions from those orphaned blocks on the old chain, which crucially allows the attacker to implement their scheme, usually that double spend we mentioned.
So let's break that down. What does this all mean for someone caught in the middle, like an exchange or a business? What specific tangible actions can an attacker take once they achieve this kind of control?
Okay, so once an attacker, or maybe a group, controls that majority hash rate, they are empowered to take several specific malicious actions. The most financially rewarding one, and probably the most common motivation, is double spending. Here's sort of the typical flow. The attacker first makes a completely legitimate transaction on the public chain. Let's say they send a big chunk of Bitcoin to a crypto exchange, planning to swap it for US dollars or euros, or maybe they buy some expensive goods online.
Okay, seems normal so far.
Right. Once that transaction gets confirmed on the public chain, maybe it gets one block confirmation, maybe a few, and they've received their fiat currency or the goods have shipped, then they launch their private mining operation in secret. When their secretly mined private chain is ready, and crucially, this private chain does not include that original transaction they just made where they spent their Bitcoin, they release it.
The longer chain they built in secret.
Exactly. And because it's longer, the network switches to it. That original transaction where they sent funds to the exchange, it's effectively erased from history. Poof. This allows the attacker to spend those exact same coins again on the new, now accepted chain.
Ah, the double spend.
That's the classic double spend. And who gets hurt most? It's primarily businesses and exchanges. The ones who accepted that initial on-chain transaction as final, they're the ones left holding the bag, effectively losing the funds. Now, beyond double spending, an attacker can also engage in transaction censorship. By controlling the majority of the mining power, the attacker basically gets to decide which transactions they include in the blocks they mine and which ones they deliberately leave out.
They become the gatekeeper.
Precisely. This gives them the power to block specific new transactions from ever getting confirmed. They could effectively halt payments between certain users or businesses they don't like, or just cause chaos. This obviously makes the network highly unreliable for real-world use. Imagine trying to run a business if your incoming payments might just never show up.
Nightmare scenario.
Definitely. And finally, a 51% attack enables transaction reversal. This is really tied into the double spend mechanism we discussed. When the attacker's private chain replaces a part of the public blockchain's history, it essentially rolls back a limited number of recent transactions. This action strikes right at the heart of one of blockchain's biggest promises: immutability, finality, the idea that once something is recorded, it can't be changed.
Right. The whole point is it's supposed to be set in stone.
Exactly. If transactions can just be reversed like this, trust in the ledger as an unchangeable record, it just shatters. And that leads to a profound loss of confidence from users, investors, everyone. But again, it's really important to stress the limitations here. The attacker's power is mostly limited to rewriting recent history. Transactions that are unconfirmed or only have a few confirmations, they can't just go back and alter blocks from months or years ago that are buried deep in the chain, nor can they steal funds that weren't involved in a recent transaction they themselves initiated.
So it's about manipulating their own recent spending, not about stealing unrelated funds or changing ancient history.
Exactly. The goal is ledger manipulation for their own benefit within those recent blocks, not arbitrary theft across the whole network.
Okay. So while Bitcoin itself, famously, has never actually suffered a successful 51% attack in its, 15 plus years now?
Correct.
Many other cryptocurrencies have. What's fascinating here is that we have real-world evidence. This isn't just some theoretical bogeyman. It actually happens.
That's absolutely right. And the history of these attacks, it offers a really critical real-world perspective on these theoretical vulnerabilities we've been discussing in proof-of-work systems. Organizations like the MIT Digital Currency Initiative, the DCI, they've been instrumental in monitoring and documenting these things. They detected over 40 chain reorgs of 6 or more blocks deep just between 2019 and 2020.
40. Wow.
Yeah, 40 significant ones. And these affected various coins. You had Bitcoin Gold, Vertcoin, Verge, Ethereum Classic, a whole range. Each of these incidents served as a pretty stark reminder that this threat isn't just academic. It's a persistent, active risk, especially for smaller networks that don't have Bitcoin's massive hash rate. And even more recently, remember that report in August 2025, the privacy coin Monero reportedly got hit by a 51% attack from the Kubik mining pool.
I remember hearing about that. What were the consequences?
Well, reports indicated the attacker was able to censor transactions and pull off double spends, and the coin's value, it plummeted by something like 13% in just a few hours. It's a potent reminder that this vulnerability is still very relevant, still dangerous in today's landscape, even for relatively established altcoins.
Let's maybe deep dive into one of those prominent examples you mentioned. Bitcoin Gold, BTG. What actually happened there, and what can we learn from that specific case?
Yeah, the Bitcoin Gold attacks back in January 2020 provide a really compelling case study. The BTG network got hit not once, but twice with deep chain reorgs in a really short period. The first reorg, they calculated about 1,900 BTG were double spent. That was worth around $19,000 at the time. Then, like the very next day, boom, a second reorg happened. This time, over 5,200 BTG, worth about $53,000, were double spent.
So combined, that's over $70,000 stolen through these reorgs.
Over $72,000, yeah. But here's the really critical finding from the analysis afterwards. They estimated the cost to the attacker to actually perform each of those reorgs was only about 0.2 Bitcoin, which back then was roughly $1,700 per attack.
Wait, $1,700 to steal tens of thousands.
Yeah.
That's a massive profit margin. It highlights a really clear and frankly dangerous economic incentive for attackers, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shows that under the right conditions, these attacks can be highly profitable. Similarly, Ethereum Classic, which is a fork of the main Ethereum network, has been hit repeatedly by 51% attacks. And these incidents, they highlight a specific vulnerability: cryptocurrencies that share a mining algorithm with a much larger, more secure network.
Oh, okay, so ETC uses the same algorithm as Ethereum.
Exactly, Ethash. Which means miners on the vastly larger, more powerful Ethereum network can relatively easily switch their computational power over to attack the much smaller Ethereum Classic network. An attacker doesn't even necessarily need to own the hardware. They can essentially rent massive amounts of computational power from services like NiceHash.
NiceHash, that's like a marketplace for hashing power.
Right. Precisely. You can just buy hash rate by the hour. This dramatically reduces the attacker's fixed costs they don't need to buy millions in ASICs, maybe close to zero fixed cost. This enables highly profitable, sort of transient hit-and-run operations. This economic model, where you can just rent hash rate, For its marginal cost, it's a significant shift from the original assumption that acquiring all the necessary mining hardware would be this insurmountable barrier.
Yeah, that changes the game quite a bit.
It really does. It makes these smaller networks, the ones with lower hash rates, particularly susceptible, because the attacker doesn't need to invest long-term. They just rent the power, strike, and disappear.
So how did these affected networks, and maybe more importantly, the exchanges listing these coins, how did they respond to these attacks? What lessons came out of it?
Well, in the aftermath, exchanges and the networks themselves, they were basically forced to adapt their security practices pretty quickly. For instance, Binance, a major exchange, initially required just 6 confirmations for Bitcoin gold deposits. After the attacks, they immediately bumped that up to 20 confirmations.
20. That adds quite a delay for users, but obviously increases security.
Exactly. It's a direct measure to try and ensure greater transaction finality, make it much harder to pull off a double spend through a reorg. But this also highlights a critical challenge in even analyzing these events. They're often transient, they happen quickly, and unless someone is watching in real time, they can be incredibly difficult to detect or analyze afterwards. Compounding that, exchanges often have a disincentive to publicly disclose successful attacks.
Why is that? Fear of panic.
Pretty much. They worry that announcing they got hit could be seen as a sign of weakness, maybe insolvency, or just poor security. That could cause users to flee. So this creates a significant underreporting problem. The true number of these kinds of incidents is likely much higher than what actually makes the news.
And this lack of transparency, this difficulty in tracking, has really pushed research groups like MIT's DCI to the forefront, hasn't it? They've basically had to build their own tools just to see what's happening.
Precisely. They couldn't rely on just anecdotal reports or exchange announcements. They had to develop their own independent monitoring systems to actively track chain reorganizations across various networks and gather empirical, hard data. Their work has been crucial in moving beyond just hearing about attacks towards building a real data-driven understanding of proof-of-work security risks. And it's illuminated the persistent nature of these threats, showing a whole range of impacts and responses across different coins. Bitcoin Gold, Ethereum Classic, but also others like Expanse, Litecoin Cash, Vertcoin, and Monero. Each case is a bit different reorg depths, different financial impacts, prompting different reactions. It really is a continuous cat and mouse game out there.
Okay, so let's pivot back to the big one, Bitcoin. Given all these real-world examples on smaller coins, what does it all mean for Bitcoin specifically? Is a 51% attack truly impossible for Bitcoin in 2025, or is it still some kind of looming, maybe distant threat we need to consider?
Right. Launching a 51% attack on Bitcoin today in 2025 is, well, economically, it's incredibly daunting. If not practically impossible, at least for any actor motivated purely by profit, Bitcoin's network hash rate has just reached these staggering record highs. We mentioned earlier, in February 2025, it was approaching 1 zettahash per second.
A zettahash, that's one with 21 zeros after it, right? Hard to even comprehend.
It's an absolutely mind-boggling amount of computational power. So to gain a majority, an attacker would need to acquire or somehow control over 50% of that. That's around 500 exashash per second. Again, just a colossal number.
And what does that translate to in terms of cost? Do we have the estimates?
Yeah, Coinmetrics, the analytics firm, they put out estimates in early 2024. They figured the cost to launch such an attack on Bitcoin would probably range somewhere between $5 billion and maybe even $20 billion US dollars.
5 to 20 billion.
Billion with a B. That's not just buying a few machines. That would require acquiring and deploying literally millions of the most advanced, latest generation ASIC miners, the ones specifically designed just for Bitcoin mining.
Okay, so the hardware cost alone is astronomical. What about the power?
And that's just the hardware cost, the sheer energy consumption to run that kind of operation. It would be astronomical. We're talking potentially requiring more electricity than entire small countries consume. Just the electricity bill alone would be financially devastating. It makes the whole thing seem economically irrational right from the start if profit is your goal. Furthermore, and this is maybe the most fundamental economic deterrent, a successful attack, or even the credible threat of one, would almost certainly cause a massive, precipitous drop in Bitcoin's market price.
Right, confidence would evaporate.
Instantly, which would immediately render the attacker's multi-billion-dollar hardware investment and any potential gains they hope to make from double spending virtually worthless. It truly is, as many have called it, a self-defeating strategy for anyone motivated by profit. You'd essentially destroy the very asset you spent billions trying to exploit.
Okay, so a direct attack by a profit-seeking entity seems incredibly unlikely due to the sheer cost and the self-defeating economics. But this raises another important question. What about the threat from hash rate centralization within those large mining pools we hear about? Could a different kind of vulnerability emerge from that concentration of power?
That's a really critical point and probably the more realistic area of concern today. The greatest, or at least the most persistent threat to Bitcoin security in 2025 likely doesn't come from some lone rogue entity trying to build up 51% from scratch. It comes from the concentration of hash rate that already exists within a few very large mining pools. As of 2025, you have a small number of dominant pools, names like Foundry USA, Ant Pool, via BTC, and collectively they command a really significant portion of the network's total hash rate.
How significant are we talking?
Well, at times, just two pools like Foundry USA and Ant Pool combined have held well over 50% of the total hash rate between them.
Over 50%, just between two entities.
Yes. Now, this concentration isn't necessarily malicious in itself. It's largely a natural consequence of the economies of scale in mining. It's just more profitable for smaller individual miners to pool their resources together. It gives them more consistent, predictable payouts rather than just hoping they get lucky and find a block on their own, which is incredibly rare now.
But here's where it gets really interesting, or maybe concerning. Because the true risk isn't about any single pool suddenly turning evil, right? It's about the potential for collusion among these few very large pools. So this isn't really a technical vulnerability in the Bitcoin code itself, but more of a social, maybe political vulnerability?
A coordination problem.
Exactly. It boils down to human coordination and incentives. We actually saw a historical scare related to this back in 2014 with the ghashash.io pool. They grew rapidly and approached that 51% threshold on their own. It triggered a huge community-wide crisis. People panicked. And ultimately, there was a sort of voluntary redistribution of hash rate. Miners recognized the danger to the whole ecosystem and pulled their computing power out of that pool to spread it around more. But you're saying that might be less likely today.
Well, the contemporary concentration of power is actually far greater than it was back then, and mining has become much more institutionalized, more professionalized. It's big business now. So expecting purely voluntary redistribution might be less realistic. Now, these large pools are still economically incentivized to maintain the network's integrity. A successful attack would crash the price of Bitcoin, which is the very asset they get paid in for mining. So they have skin in the game.
Right, they don't want to kill the golden goose.
Exactly. But relying purely on that honor system, you could say, among a small number of powerful players, that's undeniably a point of fragility. Fortunately, the Bitcoin community is very aware of this and is actively pursuing solutions. We mentioned Stratum v2 earlier.
Why a protocol upgrade?
Yeah. A key goal of Stratum v2 is to decentralize block template creation. Basically, give individual miners more control over which transactions actually go into the blocks they help mine, even if they're part of a pool. This would significantly reduce the power of the central pool operators to, say, censor transactions or coordinate something malicious, because control gets pushed further down to the edges of the network.
Okay, that sounds like a positive step towards mitigating that centralization risk. Now let's shift the calculus again for a moment. What if we consider actors with resources far beyond typical companies? Could a nation-state, or maybe even a massive global corporation, realistically attempt a 51% attack on Bitcoin? This moves beyond pure economics, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. When you start talking about nation-states, or maybe the very largest multinational corporations, the economic calculus changes dramatically. Nation-states, obviously, possess financial resources that dwarf even the most well-capitalized private mining firms. And in recent years, cryptocurrency has unmistakably become a strategic asset, sometimes a tool in geopolitical conflicts. We've seen evidence of state-sponsored actors, particularly those facing heavy international sanctions, using Bitcoin and other cryptos for things like sanctions evasion or funding various state programs off the books.
You mentioned North Korea earlier.
Right. North Korea's suspected involvement in massive crypto hacks, like the reported $1.5 billion theft from Bybit in 2025, really underscores the escalating capabilities and, frankly, the intent of some state-sponsored actors in this space. They see crypto as a source of funds and potentially a strategic lever.
So if we frame a theoretical state-sponsored 51% attack, it becomes less about making a profit and maybe more about projecting power, an act of economic or digital warfare. Perhaps even a self-destructive, scorched earth strategy just to disrupt a rival or the global system.
Precisely. That's the more plausible, though still highly unlikely, scenario for a state actor. While a nation-state could theoretically marshal the immense resources needed for such an attack, the billions for hardware, the massive energy infrastructure, the consequences would still be enormous, even for them. Yes, a successful attack would instantly tank Bitcoin's price, rendering their massive hardware investment worthless overnight. That economic loss might be acceptable if the goal is purely disruption. But, more importantly, as we discussed, a successful sustained attack would almost certainly be met with that immediate and decisive hard fork by the global Bitcoin community.
The nuclear option, changing the mining algorithm.
Exactly. That coordinated response would instantly brick all of the attackers' specialized ASICs, turning their multi-billion-dollar strategic investment into, well, very expensive scrap metal. This powerful social and technical deterrent is arguably Bitcoin's ultimate defense against even a determined state-level attack. Plus, you'd likely face significant political resistance even within the attacking nation, especially if mining operations are geographically dispersed. Miners, even in authoritarian countries, often represent significant local economic activity, and they'd have little incentive to participate in an attack that ultimately destroys their own livelihood and the network they depend on.
So, multiple layers of defense there. Economic, social, technical, even political. Yeah. But let's play devil's advocate. What if, one day, despite all these defenses, someone did manage to gain and sustain majority control of Bitcoin's network? Forget the how for a moment. Imagine the fallout. What would be the immediate and then the longer-term impact on something as fundamental as transaction finality and just the basic reliability of the network?
The consequences, if it ever happened, would be, well, far-reaching and catastrophic doesn't quite cover it. In the immediate short term, the Bitcoin network would become fundamentally unreliable, essentially unusable for its primary purpose, transferring value. An attacker controlling the majority hash rate could, at will, prevent new blocks from being confirmed by honest miners. Or they could constantly reorganize the chain, rolling back recent transactions. This would cause massive transaction delays, severe operational disruptions for every business, every service, every individual relying on real-time blockchain data. Essentially, the network's utility for payments, for settlement, would just freeze up. And more profoundly, such an attack would utterly shatter the concept of transaction finality. If double spends become possible, if reorgs become a regular occurrence, how could anyone, exchanges, payment processors, merchants, you name it, trust that a transaction is truly settled?
You couldn't. The whole system relies on that assumption of finality after a certain number of confirmations.
Exactly. That certainty would be gone. It would fundamentally undermine Bitcoin's utility as a reliable medium of exchange or store of value. And beyond just the individual double spends targeting specific businesses, a successful attack would trigger immense, wider financial implications. We have academic studies looking at past 51% attacks on smaller PoW coins. They consistently show an immediate, significant drop in the market price, typically somewhere between 12% and 15% on average, right after the attack becomes public.
And does the price recover quickly?
That's the worrying part. These analyses found that the affected coins generally did not recover to their pre-attack price levels for at least a week, sometimes much longer. It highlights a fundamental, lasting damage to market confidence.
Okay, so if that's the kind of impact we see on smaller coins, imagine extrapolating that to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the anchor, the bedrock of the entire crypto market. A successful 51% attack on Bitcoin wouldn't just cause a price nosedive for Bitcoin itself. It feels like it could unleash a wave of financial contagion across the entire crypto ecosystem, couldn't it?
Absolutely. The loss of confidence in Bitcoin, the industry's largest, oldest, and supposedly most secure asset, would undoubtedly cause a massive ripple effect. Panic would spread like wildfire. It would likely lead to a systemic crisis of trust, forcing a fundamental, painful reevaluation of the security model of all proof-of-work-based cryptocurrencies. People would question the entire foundation. And given how intertwined Bitcoin has become with traditional finance, especially through instruments like spot ETFs that institutions and retail investors hold.
Right, it's not just a niche asset anymore.
Not at all. Such an event could easily spark panic selling that spills over from crypto markets into traditional markets. It could potentially trigger a broader financial crisis, impacting stocks, bonds, everything. The interconnectedness is real now.
So we have the operational chaos, the financial contagion, but beyond the immediate monetary and market fallout, what would you say is the most damaging, the most fundamental, and maybe the longest-lasting consequence of a successful 51% attack on Bitcoin?
Without a shadow of a doubt, the most damaging and lasting consequence would be an irreversible loss of trust, period. Bitcoin's entire core value proposition, the reason it was created, the thing that makes it potentially revolutionary, is its promise. The promise of a decentralized, immutable, censorship-resistant digital ledger. Money outside the control of any single entity. A successful attack would demonstrate unequivocally that this fundamental promise is, in fact, a fallacy. It would prove that the system isn't as robust, isn't as independent as everyone believed.
And you can just imagine the fallout from that realization. A massive exodus, right? Users, developers, the big investors, they'd likely flee, resulting in a steep decline in adoption and just inflicting irreparable reputational damage, not just on Bitcoin, but maybe on the entire cryptocurrency industry. It could set the whole space back years, maybe permanently tarnish it.
Precisely. The mere specter, the confirmed reality, of a single entity or a coordinated group being able to control the network would fundamentally undermine the credibility of the whole decentralized security model, full stop. It would call into serious question the entire ethos of the technology. That trust, built up carefully over more than a decade, brick by brick, it would simply evaporate, maybe overnight.
Okay, those consequences sound truly dire, existential even. So given that, let's talk about the defenses again. How does Bitcoin's protocol, its actual code, actively defend against this kind of nightmare scenario?
Right. Bitcoin's protocol isn't naive to this threat. It's engineered with several pretty robust layers of defense built right in. The primary safeguard, the first line of defense really, is the difficulty adjustment mechanism. We touched on it, but it's worth emphasizing. This is just a brilliant piece of self-regulating engineering. It ensures that as the total hash rate on the network increases, meaning more miners are competing, dedicating more power, the difficulty of solving that cryptographic puzzle, finding the next block, automatically rises proportionally.
It adjusts every 2 weeks or so, right? Based on how fast the previous blocks were found.
Roughly every 2016 blocks, which averages out to about 2 ETH, yes. This creates this powerful positive feedback loop. As Bitcoin becomes more valuable or attractive, more miners are incentivized to join the network. That increases the hash rate. The difficulty adjustment kicks in, making it harder to mine. This, in turn, directly increases the cost of launching a 51% attack because you need even more hashing power to overcome the honest majority. It beautifully aligns the economic incentives of the miners with the overall security of the network. It's like a self-reinforcing security budget that grows with the network's value.
And it's not just a static system that was set up in 2009 and left alone, is it? You mentioned ongoing protocol upgrades earlier, like Stratum v2. How would something like that specifically help defend against attacks, especially those coordinated through pools?
Indeed, it's a living system. Beyond the core difficulty adjustment, the Bitcoin community, the core developers, they're actively working on protocol upgrades specifically designed to tackle these evolving risks, particularly centralization risk. The proposed Stratum v2 protocol is a prime example. Its main goal is to decentralize something called block template creation. Right now, in the current system, Stratum v1, the mining pool operators largely dictate which transactions get included in the blocks their pool mines. This concentrates a significant amount of power right there with the pool operator.
They decide what gets confirmed, basically.
To a large extent, yes. Stratum v2 aims to fundamentally change this. It would allow the individual miners, even the small ones participating in a large pool, to select their own transactions to include in the block templates they work on. This significantly reduces the pool operator's ability to unilaterally censor transactions or manipulate the chain content for some malicious purpose. It makes coordinating an attack much, much harder because the control over transaction selection gets distributed way down to the individual miner level, to the edges of the network.
Spreading the power out.
Exactly. It pushes power away from the center. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, beyond just the code, you have community governance and social consensus. These are arguably Bitcoin's ultimate and perhaps most powerful defenses against a coordinated majority attack, especially one driven by non-economic motives.
You're talking about that hard fork deterrent again, aren't you? The community's ability to just decide collectively to switch to a new incompatible mining algorithm if the network is truly under sustained attack. That sounds like a radical step, but you described it as turning the attacker's multi-billion-dollar ASIC investment into basically expensive, noisy paperweights overnight.
That's precisely what it is. It's the nuclear option, but it's there. Should a malicious entity, or maybe a cartel of colluding pools, actually gain and sustain control of 51% of the hash rate, threatening the network's integrity, the global Bitcoin community has this powerful deterrent. By coordinating and implementing a hard fork to a new, incompatible mining algorithm, the community can collectively choose to just abandon the old, compromised protocol and adopt a new one. They effectively create a new, clean chain where the attacker has zero power because their specialized hardware doesn't work on the new rules.
So the attacker's left with billions in useless hardware, and the community moves on to a new chain.
That's the idea. This social deterrent creates a direct, massive, existential financial risk for any attacker, even a nation-state. Any potential rewards they might hope to gain from controlling the old chain, even if just for disruption, would likely pale in comparison to the near certainty of complete financial ruin from their hardware investment being rendered instantly obsolete. Just the knowledge that this countermeasure exists, that the community can do this if pushed too far, acts as an incredibly powerful disincentive. It's the ultimate don't even think about it card in Bitcoin's deck.
Okay, so knowing that centralization is maybe the more practical risk area, how can the community actively fight against that natural tendency towards concentration in mining? What can actually be done day to day to incentivize decentralization?
That's a constant challenge, and it requires ongoing effort. To effectively counter that persistent trend of hash rate centralization, the Bitcoin community really needs to actively champion and incentivize decentralization at every possible level. This means things like encouraging participation from diverse and independent miners, maybe supporting home mining initiatives where feasible, ensuring the ecosystem is welcoming to new entrants regardless of their scale. It also means encouraging the geographical distribution of nodes and mining operations, trying to prevent too much concentration in any single jurisdiction, which could create a single point of political failure. The more distributed the network is, physically and politically, the harder it is to attack or coerce.
And what about monitoring? Can we track this centralization?
Absolutely. The use of real-time network monitoring tools and public dashboards that track hash rate distribution across different pools and geographic regions is crucial. By providing transparent, easily accessible data on where the concentration of power currently lies, these tools act as an invaluable early warning system. They allow the community to see trends, identify potential risks, and have informed discussions about mitigation before a problem becomes critical. Vigilance and transparency are key to a proactive defense posture.
We focused heavily on proof of work, obviously, because that's Bitcoin's system. But how do these vulnerabilities and defenses stack up against other ways of running a blockchain, like proof of stake or POS? What's the fundamental difference in how they handle this kind of majority attack threat?
Yeah, it's a really important comparison. The vulnerabilities we've seen in POW systems, especially the energy consumption and the potential for hash rate rental attacks on smaller chains, have definitely spurred the development and adoption of alternative consensus mechanisms, with proof of stake being the most prominent alternative right now. In a PS network, the game changes. The threat of a majority attack fundamentally shifts. It's no longer about controlling 51% of the computational power hash rate. It's about controlling 51% of the staked cryptocurrency itself.
So instead of needing billions in hardware, you need billions in the actual coin.
Essentially, yes. For a large network like Ethereum, which made the switch to POS, acquiring the majority of all the staked Ether would still be an immense multi-billion-dollar undertaking, likely comparable in cost to attacking Bitcoin's POW, maybe even more expensive depending on market conditions. But the mechanism of attack and, crucially, the defense is different. A key deterrent built into most POS systems is this concept called slashing.
Slashing, what's that?
Slashing means that validators, the equivalent of miners in POS, who propose and attest to blocks if they're caught acting maliciously, like trying to double spend or approve invalid transactions, they get financially penalized. The system automatically destroys or slashes a portion or potentially even all of their staked assets.
So there's a direct, immediate financial penalty baked into the protocol itself for misbehaving. Unlike POW, where the main deterrent is the external hard fork threat or the hardware becoming useless.
Exactly. POS has this built-in, automated economic disincentive. The attacker risks destroying the very capital they use to try and compromise the network. If you spend billions buying ETH to attack the network, then get caught, you could lose those billions instantly through slashing. Now, POS isn't without its own challenges and criticisms. People worry about wealth concentration leading to plutocracy, the richest stakers having the most control, and there are other potential attack vectors specific to POS.
Right. No system is perfect.
No system is perfect. But its built-in financial penalties via slashing provide a powerful, arguably more direct mechanism for discouraging majority attacks compared to POW's reliance on external social consensus for the ultimate defense. The whole debate over which consensus mechanism is ultimately better or more secure is still very much ongoing. They each have distinct strengths, weaknesses, economic trade-offs, and social deterrents. It's not a simple black and white answer, but rather a spectrum of different approaches trying to solve the same fundamental problem of decentralized consensus.
That makes sense. Shifting gears slightly, this whole discussion raises an important ethical question, especially for the security research community. What are the ethical implications of even researching, let alone trying to simulate a large-scale attack like a 51% on a decentralized public network like Bitcoin? It's not like hacking a company's server where you can get explicit permission first.
That's an excellent point, and it highlights a really unique challenge inherent to decentralized systems. The idea of simulating a major attack on a live public network like Bitcoin. It raises incredibly complex ethical questions right away. In traditional cybersecurity, we have well-established practices like ethical hacking or penetration testing. Security experts simulate attacks, find holes, report them, all to improve defenses before the bad guys find them. But that entire model fundamentally relies on getting explicit authorization from a central authority, the company owning the server, the organization running the network. A decentralized network like Bitcoin, by its very design, has no central authority. Who do you ask for permission to potentially disrupt a global financial network, even for research?
Right, there's no CEO of Bitcoin to sign off on it.
So how does something like responsible disclosure work in this context? If a researcher does find a serious vulnerability, how should they navigate notifying the community without accidentally putting the network at greater risk by revealing the flaw publicly too soon? It sounds like walking a very fine line. It absolutely is a tightrope walk. Responsible disclosure in a decentralized world is a much more nuanced process. Generally, it means that when a security researcher discovers a significant vulnerability, they should make every effort to report it privately first. They'd reach out to the known core developers, perhaps key community figures, maybe major stakeholders like large pools or exchanges, through secure channels. This critical window of private disclosure allows the developers time to understand the vulnerability, create a patch, or formulate a coordinated plan to mitigate the threat before it becomes public knowledge that malicious actors could exploit.
So discretion is key initially.
Absolutely. For a network like Bitcoin, this involves careful, likely encrypted, private communication. Furthermore, the very nature of blockchains is their permanence, their public record keeping, introduces unique ethical challenges around privacy and data. Researchers simulating attacks or analyzing network data have to be incredibly careful. They need to employ privacy-preserving techniques to avoid compromising any sensitive user information or transaction details during their work. It's a very delicate balance between the need for open research and the imperative to protect the live network and its users.
Fascinating challenges. Now, let's zoom out again. Beyond the financial and technical aspects, let's consider the geopolitical ramifications. We touched on nation-states. What would it truly mean on a global scale if a major state actor could, even just in theory, compromise Bitcoin?
The geopolitical dimension of a successful 51% attack on Bitcoin, or even just the credible capability to launch one, would be profound. It would be a game changer. We've already established that decentralized, censorship-resistant digital currency has become a strategic asset, or at least a tool for nation-states in various contexts. We talked about states under heavy sanctions like Iran or Russia, reportedly using Bitcoin mining or transactions to try and circumvent the traditional global financial system to bypass economic pressure imposed by other nations.
Softening the blow of sanctions, essentially.
Potentially, yes. And then you have the more aggressive examples, like North Korea allegedly leveraging large-scale crypto theft, like that huge Bybit hack reported in 2025, specifically to fund things like their nuclear and ballistic missile programs, directly challenging international security norms.
So if a state gained the theoretical ability to actually compromise or disrupt Bitcoin itself through a 51% attack, that wouldn't be about them getting around sanctions or stealing funds anymore. It feels like it would represent a whole new form of digital dominance, maybe an act of cyber warfare aimed at fundamentally challenging the existing global financial order. Could it even threaten something like the US dollar's dominance?
That's exactly the kind of profound implication we're talking about. A successful compromise of Bitcoin by a state actor would demonstrate an unprecedented capability. The ability to disrupt, maybe even control, a truly global, permissionless financial network that operates outside the traditional state-controlled systems. Such an event would have absolutely massive consequences for international relations, for national security strategies everywhere. It wouldn't just signal a new dangerous frontier in cyber warfare. It would force a complete reevaluation of how nations conduct economic policy, how they view financial stability, how they project power in a world where foundational digital infrastructure, previously thought independent, could suddenly be compromised by a single powerful state actor. The implications really do extend far beyond just the crypto market. They touch the very core of global power dynamics and the future structure of the international financial system.
Heavy stuff. Okay, looking further ahead now into the future. What potential long-term threats might emerge that could challenge Bitcoin's security in ways we can barely even imagine today? The phrase quantum threat often comes up in these discussions. How real is that, and how worried should people be right now?
The advent of quantum computing, yeah, it definitely poses a significant long-term threat to the cryptography underlying Bitcoin and many other systems. Though it's important to stress, it's not an immediately imminent threat for Bitcoin's core security today. This quantum threat generally breaks down into two main areas of concern for Bitcoin. The first, and probably the more near-term worry, relatively speaking, is a threat to digital signatures. These are what protect the funds in your Bitcoin wallet, proving you own the private keys. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer running something called Shor's algorithm could theoretically derive a user's private key just from their publicly known public key.
Which would mean they could steal the Bitcoin associated with that key.
Exactly. This could potentially compromise millions of Bitcoins currently stored in older wallet addresses where the public key has been exposed on the blockchain through past transactions. This is generally considered the more immediate quantum risk, though experts still believe a quantum computer capable of doing this at scale is likely decades away.
Decades, okay. And what's the second area? Does it relate to mining?
Yes, the second area relates directly to the mining process itself, the proof of work. Another quantum algorithm, called Grover's algorithm, could potentially offer a speed up in the process of searching for the correct hash value needed to mine a new block. In theory, this could make it easier, faster, and cheaper for someone with a large quantum computer to gain a majority of the effective hashing power, enabling a 51% attack that way.
So undermining the POW security directly.
Potentially. However, the economic and technological hurdles to actually building and scaling quantum computers to a point where they could genuinely outcompete the absolutely vast, globally distributed, hyper-specialized ASIC mining industry, those challenges are monumental. Just immense. Most experts agreed this specific mining-related scenario is likely many decades away, perhaps even further out than the signature-breaking threat. And crucially, the Bitcoin development community isn't just sitting around waiting for this to happen. They are already actively researching, discussing, and even developing potential quantum-resistant cryptographic algorithms that could be implemented in Bitcoin through future upgrades, well before quantum computers become a practical threat. It's a proactive defense posture.
Good to know they're thinking ahead. Now, what about a more conventional technological evolution? The continuous advancement of those specialized mining chips, the ASICs, you mentioned earlier they contribute to centralization. How does that play out long term?
Right. The role of advanced ASICs is another crucial factor in the future security landscape. The relentless progress in designing and manufacturing more powerful and more energy-efficient ASICs will almost certainly continue and likely exacerbate that trend we discussed, mining centralization.
So how does getting better, more efficient chips actually lead to more centralization rather than less? It feels a bit counterintuitive, like progress should help everyone.
It creates that security paradox we touched on. As ASICs become increasingly efficient, more powerful, and the cost per unit of hash power per terahash falls, it paradoxically raises the barrier to entry for the small players, the individual hobbyist miners, the small businesses. Why? Because staying competitive requires constantly investing in the absolute latest, most expensive generation of hardware, and even more critically, it requires access to incredibly cheap industrial-scale, reliable electricity. That's the real bottleneck.
So only the big, well-capitalized players can afford the best gear and secure the cheapest power deals.
Exactly. This naturally concentrates mining power into the hands of large, professionalized, well-capitalized firms and pools that have the resources to build massive data centers in locations with optimal energy prices. So while the total network hash rate increases, which is good for overall security against an external attacker trying to build 51% from scratch, the concentration of that massive hash rate within a smaller number of large, powerful entities creates a different kind of vulnerability, that internal collusion risk we talked about. It creates a new, potentially more manageable attack surface for coordination or coercion.
A double-edged sword, then. More overall security, but also more concentrated power points.
Precisely. It's a constant tension.
So putting all these pieces together, the economics, the centralization, the potential future threats like quantum, the ongoing tech race with ASICs, what does this all mean for the future outlook? What are the expert predictions? What scenarios should we be considering as most likely or most dangerous looking out over the next few years?
The future of Bitcoin security, particularly concerning the 51% attack vector, is best viewed as this ongoing dynamic arms race. It's a race between relentless technological advancement, evolving economic incentives, and ultimately human ingenuity and coordination, both for attack and defense. Based on current trends and the immense economic barriers, the most likely scenario for the foreseeable future is that the status quo largely continues. Bitcoin's hash rate will likely keep growing, albeit perhaps at a slower rate than in the past, making a direct, economically motivated 51% attack remain purely theoretical, prohibitively expensive. The constant churn of new, more efficient ASICs coming online, combined with the network's ever-adjusting difficulty mechanism, will likely continue to outpace the feasibility of anyone trying to mount such an attack purely for profit. However, we absolutely must consider the least likely but potentially most dangerous scenarios. These involve, as we discussed, a non-economic actor, perhaps a major nation-state driven by geopolitical motives, willing to pursue a scorched earth strategy to disrupt or destroy Bitcoin, regardless of the cost. Or, alternatively, a successful, perhaps unexpected or coerced collusion among several of the major existing mining pools, overcoming their usual economic disincentives to cooperate maliciously. In these extreme outlier cases, Bitcoin's ultimate resilience wouldn't be tested by a flaw in its technical code, but by the social and political will of its vast, decentralized global community of users, developers, and miners to respond decisively. That collective resolve, manifesting perhaps as that hard fork defense, is Bitcoin's ultimate backstop against existential threats.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, we've focused intensely on the 51% attack, but it's important to remember it isn't the only way someone might try to threaten or disrupt a blockchain. Let's spend a few minutes differentiating the 51% attack from some other, sometimes related attack vectors that often get mentioned, just to make sure we have a clear picture of the threat landscape.
Absolutely. A nuanced understanding is crucial here. Blockchain security is complex, and differentiating these attacks is important because they target different vulnerabilities and have different goals and consequences. A 51% attack is a direct assault on the core consensus mechanism, aiming to rewrite history. Other attacks might target incentives, network communication, or timing mechanisms.
Right. So let's start with one that sounds somewhat similar, selfish mining. What exactly is that, and how does it differ from a full 51% attack?
Selfish mining is a fascinating and more subtle strategic attack. It targets the mining incentive scheme itself, rather than just raw chain control. It was famously analyzed in a 2013 paper by Cornell researchers Ite al. And Emin Gunsier. The basic idea is this. A miner, or a pool, finds a new block but deliberately withholds it from the public network. They keep it secret and immediately start mining the next block on top of their secret block, creating a private branch. The goal is to trick the honest miners into continuing to waste their computational power working on the main chain, which the selfish miner knows will soon become orphaned once they release their longer private chain. This gives the selfish miner a head start on future blocks and increases their relative share of the total block rewards over time, disadvantaging honest miners.
So it's about gaming the system for more profit rather than directly reversing transactions. And doesn't it require less than 51% hash power?
Exactly. The primary goal is increased relative profitability. And yes, the exact hash rate threshold needed for selfish mining to be profitable is debated, but some theoretical models suggest it could potentially work with as little as 25% or 33% of the total network hash rate, significantly less than the 51% needed for a full majority attack.
Yeah.
The danger, though, is that if selfish mining becomes widespread or successful, it can reduce the profitability for honest miners. This could potentially cause them to give up and leave the network. If enough honest miners leave, the overall network hash rate decreases.
Which, ironically, makes a full 51% attack easier for someone else later.
Precisely. It could inadvertently lower the threshold needed for a true majority attack, making the network more vulnerable in the long run. So it's a threat to network health, even if not a direct history rewrite itself.
Okay, what about Sybil attacks? That sounds different again, maybe more about fake identities.
That's correct. A Sybil attack is a completely distinct type of threat that operates primarily on the network's peer-to-peer communication layer, not directly on the consensus mechanism like POW. In a Sybil attack, a single malicious actor creates and controls a large number of fake identities, or Sybil nodes, on the network. Their goal is to gain a disproportionate amount of influence over the network's information flow. They try to surround legitimate nodes with their own fake nodes.
What can they do with that influence?
Yeah.
Block information, feed fake information.
Both, potentially. They could try to fragment the network, preventing nodes in different parts from communicating effectively. They could try to censor information, like preventing certain transactions from propagating across the network. Or they could mount what's called an eclipse attack, where they completely surround a specific user or group of users with Sybil nodes, effectively isolating them from the true state of the network, perhaps feeding them a false version of the blockchain or preventing their transaction from ever getting out.
So it's about controlling communication, not controlling block creation. But could it help a 51% attack?
Crucially, yes. While a Sybil attack isn't a 51% attack itself, it can absolutely be a foundational component, a preparatory step for a larger-scale compromise. By amassing control over the network's communication layer, an attacker might be able to more effectively coordinate a 51% attack, perhaps by delaying the propagation of blocks from honest miners, or by ensuring their own malicious chain spreads faster. So it's a dangerous tool in an attacker's potential arsenal.
Got it. One more. Time warp attacks. That name just sounds intriguing. Manipulating time on the blockchain. How does that work?
The time warp attack is another fascinating, though perhaps less common form of majority attack. It was discovered way back in 2011. It exploits a different, more subtle vulnerability, specifically related to Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment mechanism that we discussed earlier. Unlike a classic 51% double spend, the primary goal of a time warp attack isn't necessarily to reverse past transactions. Instead, it focuses on manipulating block timestamps to trick the difficulty adjustment algorithm into drastically lowering the mining difficulty far below where it should be.
How do they manipulate timestamps? Don't nodes reject blocks with crazy timestamps?
There's some flexibility allowed in timestamps, a window of validity. The attacker, needing a majority of the hash rate, would set the timestamps on the blocks they mine slightly but consistently in the past, maybe just within the allowed limits. Over a difficulty adjustment period, those 2016 blocks, this cumulative manipulation makes it appear to the protocol that it took much, much longer to mine those blocks than it actually did. The difficulty adjustment algorithm then responds exactly as it's programmed to. It drastically reduces the mining difficulty for the next period, thinking mining power has dropped off.
Ah, so they tricked the system into making mining super easy for them.
Exactly. With a much lower difficulty, the attackers, still holding their majority hash rate, can then churn out a huge volume of blocks very, very quickly in the next difficulty period. They can rapidly capture a significant amount of block rewards the new Bitcoins created, and easily maintain the longest chain. So while it still requires a majority hash rate, its main goal is hijacking the difficulty mechanism to maximize future profits from block rewards, which is distinct from the immediate goal of double spending past transactions.
But couldn't that ability to rapidly build a long chain also enable a double spend if they wanted to?
Absolutely. The ability to reliably build a longer chain at will is the core requirement for a double spend. So a time warp attack, while focused on difficulty manipulation, could certainly be used as a precursor or a tool to facilitate a double spend attack as well. It gives the attacker that crucial chain building advantage.
Okay, that clarifies the landscape a bit more. Lots of different angles to consider when thinking about blockchain security. So let's try to bring this all together now. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of pot of a day to real-world attacks, the immense cost of attacking Bitcoin, the risks of centralization, future threats, and other attack vectors. What does this all mean when we synthesize everything we've learned? What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the 51% attack and Bitcoin security in 2025?
I think the main conclusion from our analysis is that the classic profit-motivated 51% attack on Bitcoin itself remains largely theoretical and, frankly, economically improbable here in 2025. Bitcoin's absolutely immense and still growing hash rate, combined with that brilliant, robust, self-regulating difficulty adjustment algorithm, creates a financial barrier to entry that is just staggering, likely in the tens of billions of dollars. And even if someone could afford it, a successful attack would almost certainly be a fundamentally self-destructive act. The resulting loss of trust and the inevitable crash in market value would likely destroy the very asset the attacker spent billions trying to control or exploit. The economics just don't make sense for a rational actor.
And crucially, you highlighted that the more realistic, persistent risk isn't some external actor building up that power from scratch, but rather the potential for collusion among the few very powerful mining pools that already dominate a large share of the network's hash rate. That centralization, as you termed it, is more of a social and political vulnerability, but one that the community is actively aware of and trying to address through things like the Stratum v2 protocol upgrade.
Precisely. And then we identified what might be the most significant, though perhaps least predictable, threat: a non-economic actor. Maybe a major nation-state operating with a scorched earth motive, viewing an attack as an act of cyber warfare or geopolitical disruption rather than a way to make money. But even in that extreme outlier scenario, Bitcoin's ultimate deterrent remains powerful: that community-led hard fork. The ability to collectively switch the rules and render the attacker's massive hardware investment completely useless overnight. Bitcoin's true final strength seems to lie not just in its elegant code, but in the distributed collective will of its global participants to defend it.
So based on this comprehensive picture, what practical recommendations emerge from this deep dive? What should key stakeholders, policymakers, financial institutions, the Bitcoin community itself be focusing on?
Okay, based on this analysis, we can offer some pretty clear, actionable recommendations, I think. First, for policymakers, instead of perhaps over-focusing resources on the highly improbable scenario of a 51% attack directly on Bitcoin, maybe the focus should be sharper on the very real, tangible financial crimes like theft, fraud, money laundering that are demonstrably happening, often leveraging smaller, much more vulnerable cryptocurrency networks. Efforts could be better spent fostering international cooperation to combat actual state-sponsored crypto theft, like the kind attributed to North Korea, and working constructively with exchanges globally to improve transparency, implement stronger KYC practices, and bolster their own security measures against hacks and exploits. Second, for exchanges and financial institutions, the gateways where most people interact with crypto. Given the demonstrated risk of reorgs on smaller POW coins, they should absolutely implement more robust confirmation requirements, especially for less established assets. Don't treat every coin like Bitcoin. Waiting for more blocks before crediting a deposit is a simple but effective defense. Furthermore, it's becoming critical for these institutions to utilize sophisticated, real-time network monitoring tools specifically designed to detect chain reorganizations or other anomalies that could signal an ongoing attack, particularly on those smaller cap assets. Proactive vigilance is really key to protecting their users' funds and their own operational integrity. And finally, for the Bitcoin community itself, the mission has to be continuous: relentlessly champion decentralization in all its forms. This means actively supporting and promoting vital protocol upgrades like Stratum v2, which aim to distribute power away from those centralizing forces like large mining pools and empower individual miners more. It also means staying vigilant in monitoring hash rate distribution, using those tools we talked about, and crucially maintaining an open, honest, ongoing discussion about the risks of centralization. This transparent and proactive dialogue within the community is absolutely essential for fostering a collaborative, adaptive defense against any potential threat, ensuring Bitcoin's security and resilience long into the future.
That seems like a solid set of recommendations. From that initial hypothetical breaking news scare, through the deep technical weeds, the economics, the real-world history, even the geopolitics, our deep dive today has really peeled back the layers on the remarkable complexity, but also the surprising multifaceted resilience of decentralized systems like Bitcoin. It's quite a testament to the original design, but also to the ongoing ingenuity and vigilance of its global community.
It really is. And as we close out this deep dive, maybe it leaves us, and you the listener, with a final provocative question to chew on. If trust is truly the foundational element of the digital future we're building, how much of that trust should we ultimately place solely in elegant code and algorithms, and how much needs to reside in the less predictable, but perhaps ultimately decisive realm of collective human will and social consensus to defend that code when tested?
That's a question that will likely echo for years to come as these technologies continue to evolve. Definitely something to think about. Join us next time on The Deep Dive, where we might explore other emerging threats in the blockchain space. Perhaps dive into some of those novel consensus mechanisms beyond PAL-W and POS, or maybe even investigate the ever-evolving role of cryptocurrency in that complex geopolitical landscape we touched upon. Until then, keep digging.
If you want to uncover the true history of Bitcoin, subscribe to our channel. The story begins here.